Good morning and welcome to our New College Past and Present Day. Although divinity has been taught at Edinburgh for over 400 years, this week saw the 175th anniversary of the laying of the New College foundation stone by Thomas Chalmers in 1846. Today, the School of Divinity and New College are almost synonymous. It's hard to imagine one without the other. We're an integral part of the University of Edinburgh, a vibrant, research-intensive seat of learning and education that's currently ranked in the top 20 in the world. But celebrating our anniversary is a perfect time to look back at our distinctive heritage, at why New College was founded, at who taught here, and what subjects were thought important. Also at the people who studied here, what their lives were like, and the links that they had with the wider world. I'm looking forward to a day of informative short talks and lively panel discussions. And I'm particularly pleased that we're able to hold the event here in New College, in the rainy hall, although, of course, I realise that most of our audience are going to be at home on Zoom. My own association with New College goes back 20 years. As a young biblical historian specialising in Christian origins, I was really excited to work with the late Professor Larry Hurtado, who was very much at the forefront of looking at New Testament texts in their historical, social, economic, and religious contexts. Larry taught me a lot about orality and writing in the ancient world, about how manuscripts can function as ancient artifacts, and about how quickly Christ followers began to worship Jesus as a god. Larry founded the Centre for the Study of Christian Origins and taught us all that a pint of beer in the middle of the day did nobody any harm. Larry's counterpart in the chair of Hebrew Bible was Graham Auld, an Aberdonian source critic who specialises still in the so-called Deuteronomic history, particularly in the books of Joshua to Kings. Graham's first post was Assistant Director of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, an early appointment which I think always gave him a rather glamorous Indiana Jones air, or at least to me. Both Graham and Larry, of course, were part of a long tradition of biblical scholars at New College, stretching right back to its very foundation. We might think of John Duncan, or Rabbi John Duncan, as he was affectionately known, the son of an Aberdonian shoemaker and first professor of Old Testament language and literature at New College. He was an atheist when he started on his theological studies, but became a believer in 1826, curiously a year after he was licensed to preach. And he led a mission to Budapest before he arrived in Edinburgh. As the Free Church gathered funds for the building of New College, he was an impassioned opponent of using any money received from slave-holding states in the American South for the purpose of building the college. And as far as we know, no money from the slave-holding states was used in the construction of the building. Duncan's knowledge of languages was phenomenal, and he knew Hebrew, Syriac, Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindustani, and Marathi. Quite incredible. And then there was Norman Porteous from Haddington, who served with the Royal Scots Battalion in World War I and studied in Edinburgh, Oxford, St Andrews, and Germany. Porteous was the first to combine the New College Chair of Old Testament, to which he was appointed in 1935, with the University Chair of Hebrew and Semitic Languages, from 1937 onwards. I have here too a handwritten dissertation, his own handwritten dissertation from 1922 on the Lucan authorship of Hebrews. After an illustrious career which saw him serving as one of the translators of the New English Bible, Porteus gave his name to one of our teaching rooms and died in 2003 at the grand old age of 104. But the New Testament didn't lack its luminaries. The name of H.A.A. Kennedy was well known to me, even as an undergraduate. Kennedy had been Professor of New Testament at Knox College, Toronto, before returning to Scotland to take up the chair of New Testament Language and Literature at New College in 1909. He specialised in the Greek language, arguing that the Greek of the New Testament wasn't a special sort of holy Greek, but the ordinary colloquial Greek of the first century. Other books included a study of Paul and eschatology, and what used to be referred to as New Testament background, more commonly context nowadays, the mystery religions and Philo of Alexandria. He was succeeded by William Manson from Cambuslang, who had also done a stint at Knox College before returning to New College in 1925. And of course, Manson gave his name to the Manson Room on the top floor. The Manson Room is nowadays used as a computer room. But when I came to New College 20 years ago, it was the New Testament classroom, housing the New Testament class library, an extremely useful collection of books and commentaries, and dozens of ancient dusty posters showing maps of Israel in Bible times, the journeys of St. Paul, or a whole one on Jewish coins, which actually I snaffled and is now in my office here. There were many other more recent luminaries as well: James Barr, Robin Barber, John O'Neill, and many others. Looking through the lists of our prestigious predecessors, I was struck by the fact that most of them are Scottish churchmen, yet with strong international connections. And their publications, while sometimes a little esoteric, tend towards commentaries, church manuals, and pamphlets designed for the person in the pew. What they would have made of our modern division between research and public outreach or impact, I don't know. But I suspect that much of what we spend our time doing now would have struck them as being rather curious. To a biblical historian like myself, of course, 175 years is a mere drop in the ocean. I'm always secretly envious of my colleagues in modern church history who have a wealth of papers, letters, newspaper articles, diaries, and even photographs to refer to. If only we had the same for the early church, a photograph of St. Paul, for example. But think of today as a taster to whet your appetite for looking into our past and present, and perhaps even thinking about our future. You can find out more about the early decades of New College on our recently launched online exhibition, which we'll be adding to throughout the year. So do have a look at it, and if you would like to send in your own memories, we would love to hear them. But now it's time to get on with the main event. And we're going to go back to the very beginning of our story. And welcome, first of all, welcome back, Professor Jane Dawson, known, of course, to many others, and currently Professor Emerita of Reformation History, who's going to start us off with a talk on the Scottish Reformation foundations of New College. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen, and welcome to everyone to take you back to the 16th century. It's not as far back as the early church, but it's home to me. And so we're going to look at foundations of New College, and three different foundations. Sorry, we're having some problem with the clicker. Oh, good. I'm a bit impatient this morning then. Try. Here we go. Back to the beginning with three different types of foundation. We're going to start with literally what is below our feet. Real foundations in the ground. Mary of Guise's house. We're also going to look at, if you like, conceptual foundations, and that is the Scottish Protestant Reformation, and what I have always referred to as the wee man in the quad. So that's John Knox, whose statue, of course, is in the quad in New College. And we're also going to look at the actual foundation of the university in 1583 and where the teaching of theology fits in to that and, as it were, is there even before the university. So let's start with what's below our feet. And clearly, this was a site which needed to, it's a big set of buildings, and that meant, as we're sitting here in the old town of Edinburgh, it meant demolishing other buildings, and particularly what was known as Blythe's Close. And there were a series of properties, most of which had fallen into relative decay from the original very fine townhouses that they were for the early modern citizens of Edinburgh. Because this was definitely a nice place to live in the 16th century. And one of the houses had belonged to Mary of Guise, who was the widow of King James V and the mother of Mary Queen of Scots. And it was a very elegant and comfortable house, the sort of place you could relax if you were a royal, rather than having all the staterooms of either Edinburgh Castle, just next door to us, or Holyrood Palace down the Royal Mile. And Mary of Guise, who seems to have been a remarkable woman, probably took this house when she was widowed, when James V died in 1542, and her baby daughter, just 6 days old, became Mary Queen of Scots. But Mary of Guise, very fine portrait here from a French painter, and showing her with a very kind but also perceptive and quite forceful personality. And what she was able to do was, although it was unusual, she became regent of Scotland in 1552. So there was 10 years when she was not regent, and that was the job of the male heir presumptive, who was the Earl of Arran, who became the Duke of Châtellerault. So Mary of Guise needed, and no doubt wanted, a nice, comfortable, elegant house in Edinburgh, which wasn't part of, as it were, the royal palaces. And we know a little about the beautiful furnishings and splendor that she included in her house, because when it was being demolished for New College, some of the 19th century antiquarians came and took some copies of the furnishings and tried to save what they could. I mean, in modern terms, this would be a very last minute sort of rescue archaeology. And we have a fine copy of what had been one of the beautiful painted ceilings. So this is a house which shows the Renaissance splendor, which was current in mid-16th century Scotland. And it is important that we think about the site of New College as being part of a much wider Scottish context. And it's rather nice we're here in the Rainy Hall, because in good mid-19th century fashion, we are surrounded by coats of arms of major groupings, the nobility, the universities, all sorts of corporations of Scotland. This surrounds New College. It is part of the Scottish life. It was conceived as being at the centre of Scottish life in a much wider sense, and Scottish identity. And so here we have, as I said, looking back to our foundations, which are the Renaissance flowering of Scotland. And there was also preserved a large oak door, and it has these medallions. Now, these medallions were part of 16th century furnishings, and they are very famous today because the medallions at the castle, the royal castle at Stirling, have been restored and repainted and give us a sense of the colour and the pageantry of the Scottish royal house in the mid-16th century. And in Stirling, these so-called Stirling heads portray real people. And Mary of Guise is thought to be this particular royal head on the slide. And there's James V, her husband, and there's various other courtiers who can be identified, and some, of course, who can't. But it's a magnificent set of royal apartments and shows off what Scottish Renaissance monarchy was like. Now, Mary of Guise, as I said, became regent of Scotland in 1552, and she ruled very well and efficiently. She also did what was her main task in her own eyes and those of her French family, the Guise, and the French royal family, because her main task was to unite France and Scotland. Now, her own marriage, and here is, of course, her coat of arms with, on one side, the Scottish royal lion, and the other, her own Guise arms, did unite the two countries. But the real crowning thing, quite literally, for Mary Queen of Scots, for Mary of Guise, was to have her daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, marry the heir to the French throne, the Dauphin. And that was the height of her achievement and should have produced a Franco-Scotland. And did produce a Franco-Scotland for a relatively short period of time. But, of course, other things intervened, and not least the very sudden death of Mary, Queen of Scots' father-in-law, the King of France, Henry II, and then the sudden arrival for Mary, Queen of Scots, and her teenage husband, Francis II, as King and Queen of France. And that changed many things. It was also a time when across Europe there was increasing pressure, most particularly in France and in Scotland, by those who were of a Protestant persuasion trying to get further concessions from the royal governments in those places. We call this in Scotland the Protestant Rebellion or the Reformation crisis of 1559 to 60. And it was Mary of Guise who was left having to cope with this in Scotland without getting the amount of aid from France that she had originally been promised. And therefore, there was a successful Protestant rebellion in Scotland, which brings what we see as the start of the Reformed Kirk of Scotland. It was able to come perhaps more easily because Mary of Guise died in May 1560. And that allowed French negotiators and also English negotiators, because the Scottish Protestants had been helped by their English allies, to negotiate a peace and to allow for a parliament to be called in the summer of 1560, which enacted parliamentary legislation, establishing, or at least setting up, an official Protestant line in Scotland. And of course, that brings us to the wee man. Here is John Knox in, again, the way the 19th century saw him, with, of course, the Bible under in his hand, and the great sort of preaching gesture, which countless students over generations have sort of reenacted and decorated his statue and all the things that have happened to John Knox, quite rightly, over many years in New College Quad. And it's Knox who tends to colour our view of what happened at the Scottish Reformation and also of Mary of Guise. It is one of Knox's less admirable qualities that he had what he would have regarded as holy hatred against his religious enemies, and in particular against those he feared, and he feared Mary of Guise. She was good at diplomacy, and he turned that into a catalogue of what he saw as deception, lying, and cheating. And of course, the main two things she could not change, or would not change, the fact that she was a woman and the fact that she remained within the Roman Catholic faith. So he uses fairly aggressive language when he describes Mary of Guise and what she does in his history. A woman born to dissemble and deceive. And then even more graphic, she began to spew forth and disclose the latent venom of her double heart. Nobody could ever accuse Knox of understatement in his insults. And, again, bringing in Mary, Queen of Scots, he refers to Mary of Guise in her accustomed manner was, and yet her daughter's, Mary, Queen of Scots, is ever to forge lies. Now, this links with the thing many people know about John Knox, which is his tract called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. And this was directed at three women, two Queen Regnants and Mary of Guise, who held political power in the 1550s and 60s. And of course, somebody who isn't on here, who was mightily offended too, was of course Queen Elizabeth I. When Knox wrote that book in 1558, his main target was not actually Mary of Guise or Mary Queen of Scots, but Queen Mary Tudor of England, who was busy persecuting Protestants in England and, of course, sending them to the stake. So one of the other things that the wee man is known for is, of course, that he made Mary Queen of Scots cry. And in this, dramatic, again, the 19th century do dramatic historical portraits very well. Whether they're accurate is an entirely different matter. But here is the romantic Mary having a wee greet, and there is Knox standing very firm. And so, many ways, Knox and Mary Queen of Scots have come down to us today as, if you know your 1066 and all that, you'll know there's a monarch who is wrong and romantic, and if we're using that in a Scottish context, that's Mary Queen of Scots, against the right and repulsive Puritan John Knox. So that is how people tend to know John Knox, as this stern, dour reformer who has formed Scottish identity. However, what I've nicknamed the New College portrait, which is a portrait that is held by Edinburgh University and was relatively recently cleaned and redated to the 16th century, so might be a much better representation of what Knox actually looked like. There is no portrait no contemporary portrait that we are sure about, but this one shows, in fact, that perhaps that dramatic man in the courtyard is a little overstated. He's a much more complex man and an insecure man, as I tried to detail in my recent biography. What he does do, though, is link New College to its Protestant roots. And he does it not just because he was seen as the great Scottish reformer, but because he was also a European reformer who was recognized across the reformed world. And that is something, as we've just heard, this international dimension, this willingness to engage with the rest of Europe, which was part of also the Scottish Protestant tradition in the 16th century. Knox had been in Geneva in exile, and so he got to know personally Calvin and Beza when he was there. And in the famous Reformation Wall statue in Geneva, he gets on, as it were, he gets on the top table. He gets there with the three Genevan reformers, Farel, Calvin, Beza, and then there's sort of Knox on the end. I mean, it always struck me that he'd sort of, in one of these photos, he'd run round and stood there, because you think, what is he doing there when there's plenty of other very important reformed theologians and thinkers and church makers in the rest of Europe? One reason is, of course, he was actually in Geneva with his own congregation. And that's also important for the foundations of the Scottish Reformed Kirk, because that exile congregation in Geneva, in a very short period of time, I mean, 4 years, well, actually probably a bit less than that in terms of working time, they produced 3 very important texts. The first is a translation of the Bible, which we nickname the Geneva Bible because that's where it was first printed. It's the Bible in the vernacular for Scotland. It is the edition that is brought and used by the Reformed Kirk at the start. And it's a very, very important edition also for technical reasons. It's the first version in English to be divided into verses. And all the biblical, everybody who has ever studied the Bible will think, how did they manage without being able to say which verse it is? Well, they had to before, but here now you have a Bible which is divided into verses and also has, if you like, a full study Bible apparatus within one set of covers. You can see at the start there of the Gospel of Matthew that it has a little explanation, you know, rite précis of the Gospel of Matthew. That's what they did. And all sorts of notes about the language, about the meaning, and so on in the text. So a very important part of the Scottish Reformed Kirk's foundation, the Bible. You also needed a book of an order of services, and this was produced initially in Geneva, again, in that congregation, and became adopted by the Scottish Reformed Kirk and is normally known as the Book of Common Order. This is the first printed edition in Scotland, 1565. So this is a second part of the kit for setting up a Reformed Kirk. The third part, which tends to be less well known, but I'm a wee bit prejudiced about this, I think is exceptionally important, is the Book of Psalms. Always in 16th century Scotland, this is just referred to as the Psalm Book. These are the metrical psalms which are sung in Scottish Reformed Kirks, and they are the way in which ordinary people who can't afford to buy a Bible, excuse me, who can't automatically read, learn how to sing the Psalms in rhyming versions, in metrical versions, and that's part of their worship. They also sing psalms on the streets. One famous occasion, they march up the Royal Mile, singing psalms as a defiant gesture. And it's also part of the great musical tradition that they create within Scotland. Many things are lost musically at the Scottish Reformation, but certain things were preserved, and preserved particularly in this series of manuscripts, which I was privileged to have a research project on the Wood Psalter. And this is the soprano or the treble part book of the Wood Psalter, which is here in Edinburgh University, in the library. And that, of course, reminds us that libraries matter, and in this case of Edinburgh, they come first. In 1580, a lawyer called Clement Little leaves his theological library to, He leaves it to the Kirk of Edinburgh to be use it and keep it to the said Kirk, to the use of ministers, elders, and deacons thereof. And that is 268 books. That is a very, very big library by 16th century standards to be gifted. And it goes straight to what becomes Edinburgh University, the Tunes College. So before even the university is founded, you actually have theology and theological books at the heart of it. Now, being a lawyer, Clement Little is aware of what sometimes happens to books, which is that they walk. And so all of his books, which are still in Edinburgh University Library, are stamped with this rather fine stamp. I am given to Edinburgh and Kirk of God, be Master Clement Little, there to remain. Keep your hands off it, because, you know, no nicking of my books. And as I said, there they have remained, and so has his mark. Now, you have a library, but you also very quickly, of course, thereafter, have a university. The Tunes College is set up in 1583, and then gets itself going, and the first group of undergraduates who graduate are seen here, and these are from the university archives, in the book that they sign, and this is signed not just by the students, but by all the staff as well, in what was known as the sponsio. And part of that was an acceptance of the Confession of Faith of 1581 of the Reformed Kirk of Scotland. So again, that awareness that graduating was also an acceptance of what by then was the official religious stance of Scotland. And not only is that part of, as it were, the tradition of theology in Edinburgh, it was also central to the first principle of Edinburgh. This rather serious chap, Robert Rollock, who becomes the first principle. He is a major theologian, again, of European standing, credited with introducing and discussing covenant ideas for the first time within a Scottish context, and bringing together European ideas with Scottish traditions. And here he is, and you can see his signature from that first sponsio book, and it's the third one down. He himself taught theology and he preached right from the beginning. It was a pretty tough schedule, and incidentally, some of the lectures started about 5 a.m. So I don't think we perhaps want to revive that particular tradition. Also, Rollock, yes, he's a professor of theology, but within the university was never meant to be only theology. It's also arts and humanities, and those subjects lived together in the university from its foundation. As one can argue, they still live together in the School of Divinity as well as the wider university. We are marking anniversaries. So yes, of course, we're looking back to here in New College and its foundation, and the foundation stone that was celebrated on Thursday. But we also ought to remember that, as has already been said, we have a longer 4 centuries, 440 plus years of tradition here on which New College is founded. So we can look back to 1580, and actually one can argue there are antecedents before that, but good old Clement Little, you have a library, you have the word, you have books, then you have the university. So quite literally, the university is founded and rests upon theology from the very beginning. So New College this building might be 175 years old, but it can be claimed that we go right back to the beginning of this university. And this is the advertising break, because I would very much like people to use the metrical psalms that you might have been hearing as part of the music today. And these are where you can find them online. And also to make it clear that there are settings for modern choirs which are downloadable, open access. Please use them and sing them, or just look at them. And because this is a living tradition, singing the Psalms is important. And that's probably quite enough from me.